In the name of the God of birth, of life, and of life eternal. Amen. Please be seated. One of the things that I often notice as a priest is how much the subject of death comes up in the context of conversations about spirituality and faith. Sometimes it's surprising to me because so much of what I know and teach about faith is that it's meant to be a source of joy. It's meant to be life-giving. And while Jesus' death on the cross is a central story in our faith, it's really not the point. The point isn't the suffering and the dying, but the hope that comes from life triumphing over death in the end. But still, we keep thinking about death. Maybe it's just human nature. In our vestry meetings, for example, we begin each meeting with an inspirational moment where each member in their turn throughout the year will spend just a few minutes talking about some moment where they felt inspired. So many of the stories that are shared are about someone significant who died. Sometimes even about the experience of being near someone's death itself. And I do understand it. Death is the one thing that really ties us all together. It is a universal experience that none of us know, firsthand at least. And death is a moment of treading the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual world. It's a threshold. So it is inherently spiritual. And when we set aside our fear and dare to marvel at it, it can be profoundly inspirational. I know some of the holiest moments I've experienced in my ministry are the times when I've been with people as they died. They are hard moments, but they are holy moments. So today we hear in the story of Jesus the story of a hard, holy moment in his own ministry. A beloved friend has died. And not just died, he has died, been buried, and started to stink. It's not like the story of Jairus' daughter that we read about a while back, when Jesus said, "She's not dead, as you say, she's actually just asleep." No, this time his friend Lazarus is dead. All the way. There was no denying it. In fact, even Jesus knew he was dead. He grieved. He wept over his beloved friend who had died. But then, through the pain and sadness and grief, he used that horrible moment by turning it into an occasion for seeing and experiencing the glory of God. Against the crowd's protests, he had the stone in front of the tomb moved away. He called out to God for help. And finally, he cried out, "Lazarus, come out." And he did. He was bound in death, but Jesus called him out and he came, and he was unbound and released into life. Several years ago, I saw one of the most incredible plays I've ever seen called The Testament of Mary. It starred Fiona Shaw as Mary, as the mother of Jesus. It was a one-woman play where Mary shared her reflections from her perspective in those post-resurrection days. She'd gone a little bit crazy and was frankly jaded and bitter about the whole experience. But one of the aspects of her storytelling that I'll never forget was when she recounted the story of the raising of Lazarus, but from her perspective. at least her perspective as the author imagined it. With hardly veiled contempt in her voice, she expressed doubt about the whole affair. But she did admit, you know what? He was never quite right after that. Perhaps he had been raised, but there was something off. He knew something. Part of the reason that play and the book that inspired it were so moving to me was because they dared to consider the humanity of Mary. We're used to seeing her in icons with a knowing smile and sort of cold eyes, with a halo drawn around her head. But we're wise to remember that God didn't enlist the services of an angel or of some sub-God to bring Christ into the world. But God found a person, a young woman, someone who, because of her own humanity, was subject to the same kinds of flaws and doubts and fears that any of us could have. And really, that's a big part of the beauty of the story of Lazarus. It calls us to consider and to really face the finality of death. That line about the stench is so powerful and so evocative. We can't hear that and sanitize it. It was an ugly and messy truth. That death was very human and very real. But even through that ugliness, God worked through Jesus to teach the people of their day a new lesson. They were taught not to count God out. They were taught to embrace a new willingness to question everything that they thought they knew. They were given this little window of preparation as they made their way into Jerusalem. A little window that might leave them open enough to consider their new reality once they finally came face to face with resurrection. For the past couple of weeks, I have turned again and again to the story of James and John pulling Jesus aside on the roadside to have a private word with him about their desire to have a favored place in the reign of God that was coming. I've heard this story all my life, so I don't really know why it keeps coming up for me again and again, but again, here it is on All Saints Sunday, and the story seems relevant to me once more. In that first sermon a few weeks ago, I said something like, this is an example of the saints of our faith not being lifted up as exemplary or ideal behavior, but being representative of behavior that we should avoid. I think that's one of the real gifts of All Saints' Day as an observance. In our religion, we naturally spend so much of our time and attention thinking about God and divinity and things holy. The gift of All Saints Sunday is that it serves as a reminder that most of the history of our faith has been made up by people like us. The physical incarnation of God in the person of Jesus only happened once. But the spiritual incarnation of Christ has been happening every day for thousands of years. And it's been happening through the imperfect lives of millions of people just like us. We lift up the saints not ignoring their imperfections, but embracing them. It's helpful to remember that when we think of these icons of saints that we see from time to time, it's helpful to remember that they weren't walking around with the glow of the halos that have been painted on their images. We put those halos there. In life, they were people just like us. So on All Saints Sunday, we remember those halos that have been placed around all the saints. The famous ones lifted up by the church, but also the ordinary ones that have lifted us up in our own lives. And it serves as a reminder to us today that we're also not walking around with halos encircling our heads. We don't have beatific glows that set us apart. But our charge is to live our lives in such a way that the people we leave behind will want to put those same halos on us. Just as we've put them on our friends and our loved ones who've gone before. Death is a holy and inspirational thing. It is sad and it is hard. We grieve, and like Jesus, we are allowed to cry. We have permission to weep and to mourn. But it is at once one of the most human experiences we have, connecting us to all of humanity that was and is and that will be. And it is the threshold into the holy life everlasting that is coming. It is the closest physical connection we have to God on this side of that line. So give thanks for the saints. Give thanks for their holiness and for their humanity. And strive to live in their example, both in their flawed humanity and in their holy connection to God that we all share. Give thanks for all the saints and for all the saints to come. Amen.